Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Peter Myers and I'm here to present to you on exploring PowerPivot and Excel and PowerView and SQL Server 2012. So I'm a SQL Server MVP. I've worked with SQL Server since the 7 release, and I've been a specialist in the business intelligence capabilities of SQL Server since 2000. I'm a mentor with a gold partner with Microsoft named SolidQ. And I include my email address here. If there are any follow-up questions that I don't get to address within the presentation or after, I do welcome emails later on. Also have business cards up front, and I'll remind you of that at the end of the presentation. And that's the presentation part 1. Part 2, we switch across to a different format. Same presentation, but that's me. I am an Australian. I've been living in San Francisco for the past 3.5 years. And that's pretty much more detail about who I am. But that's not what we're here for. Really would like to share my passion in one of the new features in analysis services now released with SQL Server 2012, and that's the BI Semantic Model. Now, the BI Semantic Model deserves some introduction, so we'll start with that topic. And then we can explore, on top of it, how to produce presentation-ready, highly interactive reports using PowerView. And then we can come back and take a look at PowerPivot and see how it's been enhanced to support model creation and optimization for PowerView. So it's going to help me to understand from the audience, by show of hands, who here is already working or have experience working with PowerPivot. Okay, so in the audience I have maybe 20% of you. It's not a requirement that you have that background. I'm going to take you from beginning to end. But it's like one of those cooking shows whereby here is the cake. But in order to get to the cake, we're then going to dismantle it and start from scratch. All right? So I'm going to show you PowerView first. Once you appreciate what PowerView delivers, then we can more sensibly design and develop a model to deliver that. And that's the structure I have in this presentation. So from strength to strength, in SQL Server 2012, we see the 5th release of analysis services. Arguably, it's the 6th release, because in SQL Server 7 we had OLAP services, but strictly speaking it wasn't named analysis services at that point. So I prefer to think of it as the 5th release. Now, when we take a look at the new feature set delivered with SQL Server 2012, we see what guided the product team was a vision to expand data model development to a broader user base. Now, the reality is this happened in the previous release. With SQL Server 2008 R2, what did we see that extended data model development to a new group of users? It's in the title of this presentation. Just checking that you're awake. PowerPivot. All right, as a free download from Microsoft, you can extend the capabilities of Excel 2010 through this add-in. Essentially, it is a data modeling environment. All you need is Excel 2010. So this is what we refer to as a tabular development approach, that using familiar concepts to most, tables, columns, relationships, we can construct sophisticated and rich data models that then can be used by traditional clients like Excel pivot tables, pivot charts, cube functions, reporting services, performance point services. And so that was our introduction to the tabular model and the Vertipack store, high compression, extremely fast query results, and all available to the business user. Well, the developers, as I mentioned this morning in the keynote, have become jealous. Why is it that they have to produce data models the hard way? And who here in this room already has experience developing cubes with analysis services? So potentially, well, more. I'd say 1/3 of the audience here. And you may well appreciate the learning curve involved in producing these type of data models is significant. Data source views, dimensions, attributes, relationships, hierarchies, then cubes, measure groups, partitions, storage modes. And then on top of that, you've got MDX. So when it comes to implementing business logic, the learning curve for MDX alone often means we refer to this expression language as mind-destroying expressions because it hurts, particularly when you come from a relational background and you have to think multidimensionally. And so there were severe limitations to allowing organizations to develop these types of models. So, with this skill set, you should be jealous to see what the PowerPivot user can do, because they can do much of what you can do far more quickly and simply. And so that's really the premise of this 2012 release for analysis services, is extending that reach of the tabular development tool presently in PowerPivot to the developer. And so we introduce a new terminology for this, all modeling in analysis services with the exclusion of data mining. Let's keep that out of the discussion. So data modeling, we now refer to as a BI semantic model. It just comes down to what flavor of BI semantic model we're talking about. Okay, so let's introduce the BI semantic model, and I went to great lengths to build this slide, mainly in response to first presenting on the topic to Microsoft themselves at a Tech Ready event, which is Microsoft's internal training conference. And it was the first time I was presenting on it, but we did so much damage because the message wasn't clear that it took a long time to undo that damage. So we came up with this single slide that should demystify what a BI semantic model is. And essentially, it's 3 different development approaches to producing a data model in analysis services. PowerPivot, as was introduced in 2008 R2, Tabular Project, which is new, and the IT Pros version of PowerPivot. And then Multidimensional Project is really quite simply a renaming of what you've always had since 2005. You have the same capabilities in this project, it has simply been renamed. All right, let's take a look at each of these 3 approaches in terms of how they're designed, developed, how business logic is implemented, how data is accessed, and the deployment considerations. So first of all, PowerPivot. It is a tabular design approach. For the target audience in mind of business users, it's Exel 2010. In fact, business users requires a little more explanation. My test is, do you need to use the VLOOKUP function in Excel? Who knows what the VLOOKUP function in Excel is? All right, you're already candidates for PowerPivot if you're not already using it. Because VLOOKUP, as a native function in Excel, is there to integrate different sets of data. And that's one of the primary things that PowerPivot does, and does very well. All right, if you're dependent on this to produce solutions in Excel, then PowerPivot is something you need to look at. DAX, Data Analysis Expressions, is an expression language deliberately based upon the functions in Excel. So again, with the target audience in mind, those that already knew Excel functions, the learning curve to implement business logic in a data model has been reduced significantly by exploiting current knowledge. If you know Excel, you know a lot of DAX. But what DAX has been extended to include is things that Excel was never designed to do. Relationship navigation, context modification, time intelligence. And so DAX is extended to include these types of functions. For data access, PowerPivot only works with caching. When you load data in, it is compressed and stored, and then when you query, that data is in memory. And essentially the way it works is a brute force scan of all of the data will produce the result at query time. It is incredibly efficient. And if you're familiar with the column store index that's been introduced in SQL Server 2012, it is the very same technology. There is no pass-through equivalent. We'll talk about it in a minute. And maybe there's no deployment story either, because it could be personal BI. That I created this model for my personal use. When I need it, I open the workbook. When I'm finished, I close the workbook. End of story. But if you would like to share the PowerPivot model with others, the supported approach from Microsoft is that using SharePoint Server 2010 Enterprise Edition and with the PowerPivot add-in for it, you can publish that workbook to SharePoint, and then via its URL and via Excel services, it becomes a data source. So essentially that is deployment. Just publish it to a library in SharePoint. New tabular project. Well, as its name suggests, it is tabular. It is PowerPivot for the IT Pro. All right, with regards to the target audience, its environment is SQL Server Data Tools. Essentially, SQL Server Data Tools is BIDS. We've gone through a rename in SQL Server 2012. No longer do we call it Business Intelligence Development Studio. It is SQL Server Data Tools, the acronym being SSDT. Do you like the way it's easy to say? Say it in a hurry, SSDT. All right, so we have this new tabular project model designer. It uses exactly the same DAX that you have for PowerPivot, no difference. It supports, in addition to in-memory, a direct query mode, which allows you then to connect to the model, query it, but analysis services will produce a relational query and query SQL Server instead. So no need to cache the data, no need to keep it up to date, and potentially a column store index at the relational level is going to do what analysis services would have done anyway. From a deployment point of view, there is a new mode of analysis services in 2012 known as the tabular mode. So now when you install analysis services as a standalone server, the feature page has a radio button. Is this multidimensional and data mining mode? That's the mode we've always had since 2005. Or is it the new tabular mode? It must be in one mode or another, and you can only deploy a tabular project to a tabular mode of analysis services. Bear in mind, you can have multiple instances on the same machine. So on the same machine, I could have a tabular instance, I could have a multidimensional instance. Now, from a deployment point of view, there's an interesting story from PowerPivot that we can take a PowerPivot workbook and do two things with it to deploy it to a tabular mode of analysis services. And this is the evolution from personal to team to corporate BI. So the first thing is very simple. Go to Management Studio. In Object Explorer, you will restore the workbook direct to the instance. Because essentially inside that Excel workbook is a backup of analysis services database. That's all it's doing. The other approach, and probably preferred, is that you will take that workbook and you will import it to create a tabular project inside SQL Server Data Tools. And then as a developer, you can extend it and enrich it perhaps beyond the capabilities of the business user. You can extend it with capabilities and features that are not supported in PowerPivot, like table partitions, database roles, direct query mode. And then you can check it into source control to protect that investment you've made, and then deploy it to the server. And that's the deployment path we potentially have from personal through to corporate BI. Last one, not going to dwell on this because it's what we've always had. It's just really a name change. Multi-dimensional project is where we develop cubes and dimensions, uses MDX. For pass-through, it has rollup. For caching, it has MDX. And it gets deployed to the multi-dimensional mode of analysis services. So hopefully this demystifies what a BI semantic model is. What it will potentially do, however, is create a new problem for you. For existing models, no big deal. Existing projects and analysis services will upgrade immediately to 2012. They'll just become multidimensional projects. But for new projects, new data models that you as a developer need to produce, you now have choice, and you'll need to consider which one is going to be more appropriate. Now, unfortunately, this topic doesn't give me time to really look at that, but essentially it comes down to this consideration: feature set. There's not complete parity between both of them, so features might determine. For example, we need multi-language model. We need Finnish and we need English at the same time. Tabular models don't support that, or not yet anyway. So it could be very easy to distinguish that it will be multidimensional because that feature is only supported. But if you get to the point where both support features that you need, the other considerations will be things like skill set, time required, and generally speaking, the skill set required for a tabular project is lower and the time is shorter than a multidimensional product. And top of that, the care and feeding required to keep that data model optimized is far less for tabular. In fact, there's nothing to do, or very little. For multidimensional, you need to ensure that you have aggregations design and that you process them and so on. All right. So there's an entire discussion and a 60-minute presentation we could give around that. So just be aware that's something you'll want to research at a later time. What we're going to talk about at this point is that once you have a deployed model, regardless of whether it's tabular or multidimensional, is that it can be accessed by your conventional tools or client applications. So Excel with pivot tables, reporting services, custom applications. The fact is that a BI semantic model, tabular or multidimensional, will expose a multidimensional interface. So to existing tools, tabular models look like cubes. Tables look like dimensions. Their columns look like hierarchies. Nothing you need to do, it's just the way that the engine exposes it. Okay, with the exception that if it's a tabular model using direct query, it cannot be queried using MDX. And that's where we introduce a new query language added in 2012 whereby DAX can be used as a query. It will return a tabular set as opposed to a multi-dimensional set that MDX returns. Take note that PowerView exclusively works with DAX query. And because in this release, the tabular BI semantic model can only be queried in DAX query, Therefore, PowerView can only be based on top of a tabular BI semantic model. Last build brings into scope the available data sources. So for multidimensional, we have always been restricted to relational stores, whether it's SQL Server, Access, Oracle, Teradata, DB2. That has meant if you have data sitting in an Excel workbook, you have to perform an ETL into relational and then build your data model on top of it. The great news for tabular is that we have flexibility. You can bring in data from relational, multidimensional. You can bring it in from OData feeds, including reporting services reports. You can bring it in from files like CSV or Excel. All right, and that completes the story of what is the BI semantic model. It is truly one model, or the vision is one model for all end-user experiences, whether it's personal, team with PowerPivot for SharePoint, or corporate with standalone analysis services, either tabular or multidimensional. All right, now that we have that background, really the heart of this session is to explore PowerView and PowerPivot. So PowerView, formerly known as Project Crescent during its development cycle, is an interactive data exploration, visualization, and presentation experience. It's targeted at the business user directly, typically a business user that needs to discover insight quickly, probably needs to present something that looks really good, and probably doesn't have the skills to write queries. They just want to be able to drag, drop, and click to produce the results they need. Now, it could be ad hoc, just a one-off. There's the answer to my question, I'm done. Or it could be that I need to store this and reuse it over time, or potentially share it with others within my department. Okay, so to make it absolutely clear, where does it fit in? We haven't lost any report authoring tool options. Report Designer is still there for the IT professional to produce libraries of managed reports, to deploy them and secure them. Report Builder is still there, although its name has changed. It's not Report Builder 3 anymore, it's simply Report Builder. Because we've dropped Report Builder 1 as a possibility that used to be available to support building reports based off report models. Did anyone work with these report models in reporting services? Okay, so they are still supported, but the designers for creating new ones have been dropped in 2012. So that tells us very clearly no further investment from Microsoft in these report models. In fact, the members of the product team that produced these report models became the PowerView product team, and that's where the emphasis is. So what is new then to supplement Report Designer, to supplement Report Builder, is a new option, which is not Project Crescent anymore, but PowerView. A PowerView report must be based on the tabular BI semantic model, as discussed, because it uses DAX query. So that can be either a PowerPivot workbook that has been published to SharePoint or a tabular database on analysis services. And ordinarily, and I think this is interesting, is that there are extra things that you're likely going to do to optimize the tabular model to fully exploit the capabilities of PowerView. Time for a demonstration. And if you saw the keynote this morning, some apology, there is some overlap. What I have before me here, I've published an Excel workbook that contains a PowerPivot model. And this is based on a sample data set known as Tailspin Toys. And here in the PowerPivot gallery, this is a library template in SharePoint, we have this new option to launch PowerView from the workbook. By the way, the other options are, there are two others. When you install reporting services in integrated mode, you will get a BISM connection file content type, BI semantic model connection type. Essentially, it encapsulates a connection to either a workbook or to a server database. And then users can use this document to launch PowerView. Or you can create a reporting services data source, and you can launch from it. Okay, so it's a little slow the first time. The reason for this is the first request is actually engaging Excel services that engages the PowerPivot system service that discovers that we don't have this database available. So it's restoring it to analysis services, and then it can query it and then provide us the designer. And what we see then is a very familiar interface to anyone that knows Office. We have the ribbon consisting of home and styles. The canvas is what's loading at the moment, which will be blank to begin with. On the right side, once the model has been understood, it will expose the field list consisting of tables and fields. Down here in the bottom right corner is what we call the layout selection. So according to what you have in focus, this is where you will configure the design of that report item. So by default, you get this blank canvas. I should point out on the left as well, this is view 1 of 1. A report really is a collection of views, like a PowerPoint presentation is a collection of slides. So you can have multiple views in the one report definition. So first off, I just put the title in, and you can put your own text here, you can format it using the home ribbon. I always think it's a good starting point to apply a filter if that's your intent. So filters can be applied at view level or individual item level on a view. So you can have different filters on the same view if you choose. My preference here is to take the year field and filter the view entirely by a selection. Okay, 2010. And then I can collapse this to expand the canvas area. And as I demonstrated in the keynote, and this is one of the guiding principles from the PowerView team, was minimal effort. So a single click of the product table introduces some fields and includes also some images here to make this really presentation ready and vibrant. And the fact that those images don't work is because I didn't do the setup properly. So when you develop a model, there's two approaches to surfacing images. Now you can put binary data directly in the model itself, which is what I thought I had done. Or what you can do is that you can reference via URL the images on a virtual directory on a web server. And that's what it's trying to do, but I haven't deployed the images yet. So use your imagination for now and just appreciate that there are some good images there that describe the different products that this company sells. All right, when it comes to making this look more visually impressive, tables are great, but to convey meaning, it's often useful to use other visualizations. So the card visualization here is just a way of showing you per row what it could look like. And I can resize, I can move, but my intention is just to resize like this. Okay, so it's very similar to what I showed in the keynote. The tiling allows us to place one image across the top, and then we can filter by them. So again, just appreciate there would be a good looking picture there. And we'll fix that as part of the model development shortly. All right, internally we can create reports. So show me by region, show me some sales. And I just want to point out different icons here. For example, if I bring in revenue, this icon here with a sigma symbol tells me that I can, in the layout selection, modify the aggregate function that it uses. So by default it was giving me the sum of revenue, but I want to analyze average revenue. And yet when I come to profitability, or let's say product cost, this icon here says it's an explicit measure. The calculation is actually stored in the model. There is no ability to change it. Okay, over here, if I click in a blank area, that's the way that I can create a new report or item on the canvas. So let's just introduce, I think I want from product, let's look at demographic by revenue, and let's make that a column. And you know what, if I was counting the clicks at this point, I would probably say I'm up to maybe a dozen to produce this report. So to make this clear, at item level, you can sort. So there's revenue ascending. You can apply a filter. So that's a chart-specific filter as opposed to the view filter that I defined earlier. I won't define that, but it's possible. And then I went on to define a scatter chart. Before I do that, note by hovering over the bars we get to see statistics. By selecting them, it cross-filters the other items on the report. And then I get to see the items that are just intermediate or professional. There's the two, this one, and there's this one. My favorite visualization is the scatter. So I could come in here and say, well, by demographic classification of the product, let's take a look at measures like revenue, profitability, and the number of products. And then if I convert this to the scatter, we get to see them visualized as bubbles within these dimensions. All right, and then the animation, I think, is the most powerful thing of this. I can take my month and say, place that on the play axis, And to see this better, like any item on a view, you can pop it out to see it in full screen mode. And because I've included a play axis, I can click here and have it animate across time. Beautiful. Pop it in. Let's take this one step further. On the home ribbon, I'm going to introduce a new view. So it's like page 2 of my report. And I'm going to collapse this. It's taking up too much space. And I don't need this header, so I can select the box and press delete. And here I'm going to bring together, let's have a look at, I don't know, demographic, I don't know, maybe category. Product category. Let's have a look at sales and profit. And then I'll graph this as a clustered column. I'll make it fill the screen. Appreciate that it does not inherit the filters from the previous view, so it's not filtering by anything, but that's actually desirable. What I'm going to do is place the quarter on the vertical multiples. So for every quarter we have in our data, and I like to sort of break this down so it's like 4 by 2. Is that all I have? That's all I have. There's an optimization I need to do. There's actually giving us the quarters 1, 2, 3, 4 for all years, so it doesn't actually make sense to do this. So it would make sense if I applied a filter at this level. So let's filter it by 2009. Okay, so hopefully now you can appreciate, when you think about the target audience for this, how simple it is for a well-designed, optimized tabular model to allow users to explore the data and interact with it. The last part of the demonstration then shows how we can share this, if you choose to. I could click back and I could say just leave the page. It doesn't save it at all. It was ad hoc. Or I could choose to save it, in which case you have the options to save it to the PowerPivot gallery or to any library in SharePoint, but you have a benefit when it's in the gallery because the snapshotting that provides previews works for PowerView as well. The other options you have to print it as static images or to export it as a PowerPoint document. And the really cool thing about this is that that document, when it's in presentation mode, includes a button in the bottom right corner, Make Interactive. And when you click it, providing you have connectivity and permission yourself, it will communicate with the data store and provide the exact same interactivity you have here in the browser. All right, so you could be in the middle of a board meeting and someone asks a question about what happened last year. No problem, interact, change the filter. That's what would have happened. All right, now that I hit back in the browser, we should see that we've got this extra document called Sales Analysis, and there's the previews. Hover over the different views. The user then can click to actually open that up. And there's the report. If you want it in presentation mode, then switch to full screen mode. You'll press Escape to exit. And then you can just interact with it. Go ahead, let's now sort by descending revenue. Let's filter on a different product. Let's pop out this and animate across time. And that's interesting, but what happened for the previous year? Well, let's filter and let's have a look at what did in 2009. And some different story plays out. As far as navigating between the views, in the bottom left corner, I can go ahead and pop them out and switch to my new view. Or in the bottom right corner, I can navigate like pages. And that's PowerView. All right, part 2. How did we get to that point? It didn't happen by magic. All right. So there are 2 approaches to tabular model development. PowerPivot, so the business user could actually create these models themselves and publish them. Or it could be that as an IT professional, you've created a corporate model and optimized it for this experience. So both approaches are fine. We are going to explore PowerPivot in this session. So PowerPivot has been designed to empower end users, business users, to create self-service BI solutions and manage them in SharePoint. So there are 2 add-ins that achieve this. We've already talked about this. The add-in for Excel is a free download from Microsoft. Be aware that in SQL Server 2012, new modeling and designer features, including new DAX functions that build upon the 2008 R2 feature set, are now available. So this is pretty much a list of what you're going to get in addition to what you already have. Don't make me read through this list. I have a demonstration that will touch most of the important ones, okay? So don't even have to memorize it. There's also an advanced mode. So it was the result of some user acceptance testing at Microsoft that said, well, for the target audience, you're introducing so many new features that it will confuse them. And so really it's only advanced users that would need these capabilities. Therefore, hide this capability, and if they know they need it, they can turn it on. So if you switch to advanced mode, you will have an additional ribbon, and it will allow the configuration of perspectives and the optimization of your model for the purpose of PowerView. 41 new DAX functions. I'm not going to read through these either. But let me just point out some of the major groups. If we talk about information functions, we can look up the authenticated user. We can look up values based on conditions. These are very, very useful, in particular for database roles that can configure security. And we can use dynamic expressions with DAX to say, for example, the current user can only see the sales that come from the country that they are related to. The parent-child functions will simulate parent-child hierarchy. We don't have true parent-child hierarchy in tabular design, but you can naturalize into fixed levels of parent-child hierarchy using these new functions. Statistical functions include distinct count. So we now have measures by distinct count. We have ranking, top N, standard deviation, and variance. All right, so with that introduction, really the rest of this presentation is to explore these new features in demonstration by creating from scratch the PowerPivot workbook that supported my PowerView demonstration, enhancing the model interface, defining measures and a key performance indicator, defining a perspective, analyzing the model to test it, publishing it to SharePoint, and then seeing what it looks like. We'll come back to the resources shortly. So this is pretty straightforward. We launch Excel, we make sure we have the PowerPivot add-in, and we make sure we have connectivity to our data stores so that we can load data from them. So here on the PowerPivot ribbon is where you launch the PowerPivot window. If you don't see the PowerPivot ribbon, then you haven't installed the PowerPivot add-in yet. It's as simple as that. All right, on the home ribbon is the group whereby we can import data, whether it's from Microsoft products, from a reporting services report or Azure Data Market, data feeds, text files, or a large variety of other providers, including generic OLEDB or ODBC. So my demonstration is going to build up the Tailspin Toys, and I have the Tailspin Toys database here. So I provide a friendly name for the connection. I have an option for relational to import from tables and views or to create a query that will produce the table in the model. The first time I will use this option, and I'm going to bring in that I need date, and the friendly name is the name that will be the table name in my model. So dim date, well, that means something to us. That's a dimension table. But to business users or anyone consuming this model, dim is confusing. Fact is confusing. Keep things simple. So preview and filter, and we can see in this window that we have a date ID, we have a date type, and we have different forms of the time. At this point, you can choose to vertically filter by removing columns. And in fact, this is an important optimization for tabular. Do not include columns. Do not include rows that are not relevant to your model. Because of the in-memory nature of this product, they will take up precious resource on the server. So if you don't need it, don't introduce it. I need year, so it comes back. All right, the next one that I introduce will be the product. Preview and filter. I pretty much need everything with the exception of these columns for retail price and wholesale price. Note the binary column here. This is new in 2012, and it's there to support the introduction of images that can be used in PowerView. Again, as an optimization, I actually suggest you don't do this, in particular if you have many rows or that binary data is big, because it's going to take up precious resource again. The preferred approach for PowerView is that you go ahead and store them on an external web directory, And then via the fully qualified URL, you'll have a calculation in this column, well, not in this column, in your model, and you will then specify that this is an image URL, and then PowerView will know to use that URL to retrieve the image. But today, I will use the photo itself. Okay, so I have date, I have product, and then I need my sales information. And in this table, being a fact table, it consists of the keys to my dimensions and some measures, of which I don't need profitability. Because in fact, the reason that I'm creating a PowerPivot model is twofold. Yes, I want to use PowerView, and PowerView doesn't work on top of a relational corporate store such as this data source. So I need a tabular model. But the second thing is this. The profitability that's in the corporate database doesn't suit my needs. I keep the cost for each product to produce it in a separate Excel workbook. And I want to create a model that integrates my calculation for cost to produce profit from the corporate revenue. All right, so that's my purpose. Now when I click Finish, the table import wizard creates 3 tables in my model. We see statistics for the number of rows loaded. When we click on details, we'll see that the foreign key relationships that exist between tables in the source system have been defined as relationships here in this model. And a great new feature now available both in PowerPivot and the Tabular project is the ability to switch on diagram view. So we can now look at the model either from grid view, rows and columns, or from the diagram itself. And if it's comprehensive, you can navigate around it. I'm just going to resize things a little. And what you see is what you get at this point. And some developers or business analysts may be more comfortable working in this type of design. Be aware that in this design you can do most things that you can do in data grid design, but there's some distinct things you cannot do. For example, all calculations must be done in grid view, and hierarchies must be done in diagram view. But pretty much anything else, you choose what works best for you. All right, so we need to bring in some more data. I didn't bring in state or region. In fact, it's what we refer to as a snowflake. States belong to multiple regions. We have 2 tables. And yet in my model, I want 1 table. So what I can do on the design ribbon is open up existing connections. And when I open it up, it relaunches the table import wizard. And so I reuse that connection to write a query that I'll name state. Now I could type in my query right here, if you know your select statement very well, or you could copy it from your favorite tool like Management Studio. Or you could click Design. And if I then turn this off and say, let's use the graphic designer, does this look familiar to anyone? It's nice to think at Microsoft that the product teams are actually sharing the same cafeteria. At lunchtime, they're sharing ideas, and I can see the reporting services team say, we've got this great relational query designer. And the analysis services team going, hey, we need that. Can we have it? So it's really, really cool to see that we've got reuse of familiar tools. And so I can come in here and say, give me the state ID, give me the state name, and from the region table, knowing that there's a relationship between them, I can introduce columns from both sides. I can test by running, and then when I click OK, it copies the valid select statement into this box. And I'm just going to go ahead and alias these columns, which is just a quick way to rename them. And now the table import wizard creates a new table based on the result of that query. To create the relationship, I just drag and drop. And now I have state. All right. Well, now I need to start working with the product cost that I have defined. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce from a file those details. So I can browse. And by the way, this is a lab that I wrote for Microsoft, or it's based on one. So sitting here in my assets, I have product cost. And yes, the first row has headers. And we'll keep the name product cost. If we preview and filter, we'll see that it uses the stock keeping unit as its identifier, includes the product name, which I will exclude. because I already have the product name in the table, but this is the valuable information that I need, the cost to produce each of these products. I have a question here.
What about the situation that you have multiple keys in the table? In the old PowerPivot, you couldn't do the relations between the tables if there's multiple keys.
Okay, so the question is this. If you have a composite key, there are actually multiple columns that uniquely identify each row. We still have that limitation in PowerPivot and tabular development that you may only create relationships between single columns. That forces you to use a calculation that would somehow combine the values of those multi-columns to produce a unique single value. That has not changed in this release. I share your exasperation. All right, click Finish. That introduces data from Excel. And this is just the ease of integration, because you see now that I have this extra table, that if I just do a drag and drop from here, that's like the VLOOKUP function in Excel, but I think anyone that's worked with VLOOKUP would appreciate that's far easier. It's going to work with far larger volumes of data and extremely more efficiently than VLOOKUP ever could. And that's why we like to promote PowerPivot to this audience. All right, so this is the basis of my model. There is enhancements that I can do at this point to make this model more consumable. So let's start with the date table. If I right-click and go to, that's the way you jump back to the grid view. So the first thing I like to point out here is a new feature here on the design ribbon that we can mark date tables. The importance of doing this is that then the model knows where date is defined. It doesn't assume that the name of your table defines what it does. All right, the benefit of this is that the time intelligence functions just work, and that if you're using this as a data source, for example, in pivot tables in Excel, when you filter on the date dimension, because of course pivot tables don't understand tabular, they think it's a dimension, they know it's a date dimension, and they will give you time-related filters. All right, it does require that you have a date column in your table. Next thing we can do, we can hide columns. So I don't want end users working with these direct. Hide these columns from the client tools. And then next I want to produce a hierarchy, but then I note that this really should be the year dash quarter. So I rename this column to become quarter old. And then I create a calculated column that is equal to year, concatenate a space with a dash, and then put the quarter. And then I'll rename this to become the quarter. And then I can hide this. It'd be preferable that we fix the source data, but this solves the problem. The last optimization for this table then is to produce a hierarchy to allow navigation from year to quarter to month. As I mentioned, hierarchies cannot be defined in grid view. So if we switch across to diagram view, and if I pop this table out, a multi-selection of these is the fastest way to do it. You can create a hierarchy based off those columns, and it will sequence them correctly. How does it know this? Well, it actually does look at the data, the cardinality, the distinct values, and it did determine that there were less years, more quarters, and even more months. So that must be the order. But you may resequence them if you need to, just by drag and drop. Okay, that's the optimization for date. Well, actually, this would be the optimization, in my view. Only expose the hierarchy, don't expose the columns themselves. We could do the same for state, but it's just a repeat of what I've done. Likewise with product, I have name and SKU, category and name. So I won't do it there. I will just hide these. I don't want the keys being shown. I think it's a great idea to rename columns to make them more friendly. So I'd like to rename this so it's just stock keeping unit. This becomes product. And because we're optimizing this model for PowerView, even when we have two words together, for example, item group, we strongly discourage this in the database design world, but in the modeling world, with the understanding that business users are connecting to it, make it friendly. They're two words, put a space in there. It will look far more professional within PowerView because you cannot rename them in PowerView. And so I choose to rename these. Okay, for sales. Well, sales consists of dimension keys and measures. So this requires some special handling. Remember that all calculations are done in grid view. So we want measures to allow us to aggregate these different columns. Now before I do this, we also need cost and profit because that's my objective. So here in this column, I just say, use DAX, go and get the related product cost table product cost field. Now that's pretty cool because if you stop and think about it and look at the diagram, in order to bring up this calculated column, it must navigate to here to get this. It just does. You don't have to tell it how, providing these relationships are in place. All right, so I can go back and we'll rename this to become cost of goods sold. I will modify the function as well. We should multiply it by the quantity. So it's the true cost for that line within the table. Also, note that the format's different. This is currency, this is just general. So I changed this to currency as well. This is important because formatting inside your model now will be passed out to the query results. Okay, now for these three columns I multi-select, and here under measures I can create measures automatically using the sum aggregate function. Note the addition of distinct count that is new in 2012. Alright, so what you see is the calculation area where measures are defined. Very different from calculated columns. A calculated column is row assessed. For each row it evaluates and it actually stores its result in the model data. In contrast, these measures are evaluated at query time inside the context of your filters. What's on the columns, what's on the rows, and at query time it will evaluate that expression. So the format is measure name colon equals DAX expression. And that DAX expression will always be an aggregate function of some variation. So here I rename this to say this is just units. And I can also format measures. So I will say it's comma separated, and you can already see the result down there, and it's 0 decimal places. Sum of revenue becomes sales. And this just becomes cost. And now with these measures, I can create new measures. Order and location doesn't matter in this grid. Put them wherever you want. Profit, colon, equals the sales measure, subtract the cost measure. And then we format it as currency. And then, to be different, over here, profitability, colon, equals the profit as a ratio of sales. And this will be formatted as a percentage. And as I showed this morning in the keynote, measures can now be promoted to become key performance indicators, whereby we have a value that's compared to a goal, and then we evaluate a status. Is it good? Is it bad? And so here, I will evaluate it based on its own value. If it's 5% or less, it's bad. If it's 10% or above, it's good. Anything in between is slightly bad. And there we go. The difference here is a KPI does not support trend as a multi-dimensional KPI would, but it does support value, goal, and status. So now when we switch back and look at our model, we see that our sales table is much more interesting. And in fact, I can multi-select these columns and hide them from the client tools. We only want to expose these measures and this KPI. And I can also right-click this entire table. Its purpose was to support this column and this calculation. I do not want business users even knowing it exists. All right, and that's pretty much the optimization of the model. Perspectives. So by default, you don't see that advanced tab. You need to turn it on, and it stays on until you turn it off. Maybe I need a perspective because this model is so complex that anyone that has a monitoring related question, they only want to see the hierarchy of calendar, they just want to see the product name, and they want to see the KPI for profitability. All right, and now when they connect to it, as you can see in diagram view, this is what the model looks like to them. Be aware it's not a security mechanism, it's a visibility mechanism. So where are we in the sequence? We have imported data and created relationships. We've enhanced the model interface with relationships, hierarchies. We've defined measures and a KPI, and I just showed you how to define a perspective. Well, at this stage you might want to test the model, and perhaps the easiest way to test it is in Excel itself. Easily done from the PowerPivot window on the home ribbon. Let's just go ahead and create a pivot table in the existing worksheet. And the PowerPivot field list, new in this release, it supports selection of a perspective. I can take hierarchies and use them, like for filters. Go and show me in 2011, quarter 1, February. We can introduce what's visible here anyway, measures and the KPI value and status. Let's have a look by product. And we can use the slices on the vertical or the horizontal. That's pretty much the demo I gave you this morning if you were there at the keynote. And that's a great way to test. Are those measures actually doing what we expect? Sure. Test them here if you're satisfied the model is doing what you expect. Now, on top of that, I'd like to make some comment about volume, because the data I have in this sales table isn't terribly significant. I think there are some 16,000 rows. I can only ask you to believe me that if I had 16 billion, and I'm not joking, 16 billion rows, even on the hardware I have here, if I had 4 gig of RAM on the desktop, that would work with the same speed result. It really is extremely impressive. We have one customer in the US, a major retailer. Believe it or not, they have 12 million distinct products. We have years of their data sitting in a tabular project, and the lightning fast responses are unbelievable. Even with distinct count measures that in the OLAP world often perform very, very poorly, because every query results in a brute force scan of in-memory data. It is mind-staggering. You have to see it to believe it. Unfortunately, 16,000 rows, I appreciate, isn't very convincing. You have to take my word for it at this stage. All right, so we're up to, I think, some of the final steps. We've analysed it. We're satisfied it's good. I could publish it at this point, and I could show you what it looks like in PowerView, but I'm going to have to tell you, because time isn't sufficient, what problems we have in PowerView. And these are the problems we're going to have in PowerView with this model. Let me switch to diagram view. First thing we need to appreciate is that certain features are not going to be visible. Obviously, hidden tables, hidden columns, hidden measures are not visible. That's by design. Unfortunately, hierarchies are not visible in PowerView. That would force me to go ahead and unhide these to make sure that those fields were visible in PowerView. So in this release, no hierarchies. Make sure those columns are visible. Next. Name things appropriately. We went through that. Providing descriptions. So if I right-click the table tab here, products defined by marketing, whatever makes sense to convey to the business user. We can attach descriptions to tables, columns, measures, the KPI and their metrics. Although KPIs aren't surfaced in PowerView either, except the base measure that the KPI is based on will be there. All right, and that is the way through a tooltip. When you hover over a table or a field, you will see things like products defined by marketing. So that's another optimization. All right, so I've just mentioned KPIs are not, perspectives are not. PowerView will only connect to the default perspective that says the entire model. So you can't benefit from perspectives in PowerView either. So the last topic really is about managing the report properties and measures. So available on the advanced ribbon, we have this set known as summarize by, default set, table behavior, and image URL. First one I'll point out is image URL. I have a binary image here, but I could have chosen to have a text column that contained the fully qualified URL. And then I would simply check this checkbox, and PowerView, providing the user has permission and the images are there, those images would surface in the model. At table level, as I demonstrated earlier, if I create a new view, that simply by clicking the product table, miraculously, we end up with these fields in this order. Well, the way that that is configured is the optimization with the default field set. So here you just choose the columns of interest, add them, and sequence them. And it's as simple as that. With a single click now, users can go ahead and create a table based off those fields. Next, table behavior. There's some extra metadata that PowerView needs that the tabular model does not automatically surface. For example, what is the column that is the unique identifier? Like the primary key. So that's going to be helpful to PowerView for certain activities. The keep unique rows isn't so more easily understood. Really what it's asking is, what columns have a one-to-one relationship to the key? So the stock keeping unit, it's unique as well, as is the product name and the photograph. Category is not. There are multiple products in some categories, so that does not keep unique. The optimization here is this. If you're creating a matrix and you say, I want product and its stock keeping unit, the default behavior is that stock keeping unit will group within product. But there's truly a one-to-one relationship. And via this configuration, it will know that they're at the same level. Okay, and what you will see in the designer is this. This icon represents that they're at the granularity of the identifier. Finally, the default label. So what column describes the rows in this table in user-friendly terms, and what image, because there may be multiple, should be the default when used in a report. And pretty much they're the optimizations. So it's an extra step. If you understand that your model will be used in PowerView, there are certain things you need to do to compensate that PowerView does not give you hierarchies or KPIs, and there are things that you need to do in terms of metadata to allow PowerView to fully exploit the data and present it within that model. Now, one last topic is measures, and I'll finish off with this. It's perhaps the most complex, and it works like this. This summarized by property describes to reporting tools, like PowerView, how to expose that column. All right, and this is how it works. I could come in here, and I'll just remind you, in the sales table, remember how I had different symbols. The sigma symbol said you could change aggregate function just by using the drop-down. The calculator said, no, you can't. It's fixed. All right? This is how it works. If it's an explicit measure, then you cannot change it in PowerView because the calculation is defined. If I want revenue or sales to be flexible, this is what you have to do. Go ahead, delete the measure. That'll corrupt some of the model. I rename this column to become sales. I unhide it. I fix my calculations by now saying, we'll just take the sum of sales and subtract that measure. And that fixes these up. And same here. Now the rule is this. If this column and its data type is currency or it's decimal, PowerView, because of the default setting of this, will create an automatic measure. In contrast, this column that is using whole number will not, because whole number does not automatically surface a measure. But I could come in here and say, use sum, in which case it will become an automatic measure that will default to sum. I know this is a little complex and a little involved, but a little bit of practice makes this a little easier. That is perhaps the most complex topic. So the good news with this is this. Sales now supports flexible aggregation in PowerView. However, there is a bad side to this. If you use an OLAP tool to connect to this model, we can't analyze sales because there's no measure. All right, so you have to make a decision. Do I want automatic aggregation or do I want fixed, in which case the Cube browsers can use it as well? And unfortunately, in this release, that's one of the things you're going to have to fight with. What's more important, optimization for PowerView or optimization for OLAP clients? There's no good answer at this stage. All right, so that gets me to the end of the demonstration. What's required to produce from scratch a model using PowerPivot and an exploration of the new features in 2012. We then looked at how to optimize it, and what I'll leave you with is, and that's a little out of date as of yesterday, if you're not aware, RTM, the release of SQL Server, is now available, so evaluation can be downloaded. In fact, it's what I've demonstrated from. There are some session recordings that go into these products in a little more detail, like PowerView and PowerPivot. The PowerPivot team blog is an excellent blog for what's new, what challenges you might face, and what the product team's advice with those challenges would be. We have PowerView overview. And that's pretty much where I needed to get to. So are there any questions before I close? Just quickly.
What editions of SQL Server do you need?
So what editions of SQL Server for? There's two answers here, because tabular can be delivered either through PowerPivot. Okay.
PowerView. If I were to use PowerView, what?
PowerView, you are going to need two things. You're going to need SharePoint Server 2010 Service Pack 1 Enterprise Edition. You're going to require Reporting Services for 2012 add-in for SharePoint, Business Intelligence Edition or Enterprise Edition.
Expensive.
Yes, potentially expensive, right. But if you're already working with SharePoint, then you're good. If you're SharePoint 2010 already, you're pretty good just to upgrade to Reporting Services 2012 and you'll have this capability. Are there any other questions before I close? Time's pretty much up. If not, I'm happy to take questions offline. Just a quick marketing plug. If you're looking for training, consulting, mentoring in this space, I have business cards up front. Please come up, grab one. We would love to hear from you. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time and attendance.